Okay. Well, with that, then I guess I would just say we're very pleased tonight to have. Let me do the counting again. 1, 2, 3, 4 individuals, I guess, from um, the Water and Environmental Resources Division of Lynker Tech, who have worked as a consultant or a contractor to the state. And they're here to talk to us tonight about the Future Avoided Cost Explorer. So I'll let you guys take it away.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jim, and thanks, Dan. So, thanks all of you for inviting us to be here tonight to present. We appreciate the opportunity. So we're going to look at the Future Avoided Cost Explorer. So this is a tool that we developed for the state of Colorado, specifically for Colorado Water Conservation Board and the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. And I'm just going to quite briefly give you an overview of the provenance of the project and how we got involved in this and what the key angle is, what the focus of the project is about. And then I'm going to hand over to Ryan. Are you guys getting any feedback? Okay, it's just on my computer.
So, yeah, we're getting a little echo. I'm hearing it too. So if everyone else can mute themselves.
That'd be great. Appreciate it. Thanks, guys. So just so you can get a sense of, it's never just one person or one team, right? There was quite a village on this project, and these are the key collaborants on the state side. So, as I mentioned, DHS, EM, Colorado Water Conservation Board, and then we also had Colorado DOLA, the Forest Service, and CSU were providing quite a bit of help and support and various bits of information to the project. The next slide's got the logos of the various partners that we picked up. So again, despite our experience and expertise in this general area, we did recognize that we needed some folks to join us. And we had, for example, a team called Technosilver from Fort Collins joined us just down the road from me here that do a lot of the wildfire modeling for the state of Colorado and California now. So they helped us with the wildfire component, as did Anchor Point. And then a few other folks joined the team as well. But this was primed by Lynker and primarily led by our technical team. So next slide, please, Ryan. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to go through this evening, we'll give you some background. That'll mainly be me. Then Ryan's going to get into the technical approach a little bit. And I say a little bit, this is a fairly big, complicated project as the general content implies. We're looking at not just natural hazards and how they impact various sectors, but we're also looking at projections of how these might be exacerbated into the future, both by climate change and population growth. So we'll try and give you a sense of how we proceeded with this project without really digging in too deep. And do want you to recognize that this was developed for state level interaction. So that would be, large swaths of the state legislators at the state level, and then folks that are involved in the same types of projects more regionally, not necessarily for detailed local information. So this is why we're excited to interact with you guys tonight, because there's certainly a lot of value in this tool, we feel, for local groups, cities of Fort Collins, Loveland, for example. Even smaller communities like Red Feather and Masonville could benefit greatly from this. But what the input we'd like to get from you tonight is, after you've seen the presentation and understood a little bit more about it, is how this might be scaled to answer some of the questions that you may have in this general domain. So that'll be section 4 then. And then once we've paused for some questions, we'll show you what we're intending to do next in various domains, and then we can have a broader sort of discussion if we've got time. So next slide, please, Ryan. So the key project steering questions then, the primary one is to look at what is Colorado's current and future risk to flood, drought, and wildfire. So this started with a notion, and we've got 10 or 15 years or more in this realm working with the state to understand what is the current hazard and vulnerability of Colorado and the various sectors across Colorado. So sectors would include things like agriculture, recreation and tourism, municipal water supply, to each of these natural hazards. So, obviously this is always topical for us. It seems we've always got a drought period, which we're right in the middle of a really significant drought right now. We're experiencing wildfires up until hopefully today might have just squished out Cameron Peak fire, but we've been enduring that all summer. And then of course floods seem to come around both spring and winter, and occasionally in summer as well. So we get impacted by all of these. And there's compound issues as well, with some of the floods, for example, getting exacerbated by debris flows, which are partly a function of wildfires on upslope areas. So these hazards are all costing the state a tremendous amount of money, and potentially could set the state back in terms of our ability to develop sustainably into the future. So recognizing this, working with the state on projects about 10 years ago, looking at drought vulnerability, we helped the state understand that if you want to be able to express this in convincing terms to your stakeholders or your legislature, you really need to try and monetize the impacts of these natural hazards on the various sectors right now, as in contemporarily, but then also to be able to start planning more sensibly and looking to mitigate for these natural hazards, and particularly how they're impacted by climate change and population growth. We really need to monetize it, and we need information that includes impact data that can then be taken to vulnerability data that can then be brought into calculations that can enable us to work out how much this is likely to cost the state right now, but then presumably a greater cost into the future based on climate change and greater vulnerability from more people living in the state. There's general agreement that the state's population is going to double by 2050. So we've seen a few setbacks to that growth, but it is starting to accelerate again right now, it seems. So climate change and growth were the two key future focus, and that was on a 2050 timeline. And then we couldn't look at every sector, but we selected key sectors, which Ryan will describe in some detail in a moment, with the idea that there are some key drivers to the state's current economy, recognizing that the economy may necessarily adapt to this challenge and other things that might come along that we're not able to take into account yet. So it's very much looking at things right now, both from the point of view of natural hazard impacts and the current economy, the current sectors impacted by these natural hazards, and then projecting climate change forcings on each of these natural hazards, impacting potentially many more people because of the population growth. And then finally, what's the point in doing this? Well, the state really wanted a tool that could really influence state legislature. So in other words, politicians, because they're on a 4-year cycle, don't generally have a lot of incentive to invest in very much beyond 4 years, because they're not going to get judged by that. But that is the common problem globally, is that both climate change and population growth are happening and increasing in terms of their magnitude and impact on economies, both locally and globally, at a rapid rate, but they're outside that 4-year or even 8-year political cycle. So how can we generate information that's defensible, impactful, and understandable that could potentially influence a politician to want to work with their stakeholders to start investing in making a more resilient future to things that are really critical to Colorado's growth and our sustainability. So that's really the focus of this project. And that's quite a big ask. And then, of course, we didn't just want it to be useful for educating and influencing politicians. We also wanted it to be useful for folks such as yourselves on the ground. So this is the key target. So I mentioned the legislatures. Planners can always do with more information that help them make more sensible planning decisions, provide more useful planning information that's actionable to their communities. Basin roundtables are increasingly focused on ever more dwindling water resources and how to distribute those equitably and how to protect the water that supports their stakeholders. So they are interested in this type of information, particularly as it relates to water supply and the hydrologic impacts of climate change. Industry representatives are really potential customers for this tool because they want to know where to invest. Folks coming into Colorado want to make sure that they invest in crop types that are going to be resilient to future conditions, not just the current conditions if it's a long-term investment. Developers want to understand what type of development makes sense, where does it make sense, and how are they going to sustain that and guarantee the sustainability of residential, commercial, or other types of investment into the future. And then, of course, the general public. And the primary reason for that, from my point of view, is that's the folks that vote. And if we can influence them and help them understand that voting for resilience actions is smart and is at least going to be a very positive thing to do for their children, then this could be a win. So I'm going to hand over to Ryan now, who's going to lead you through a fairly high-level overview of the technical focus of the project and some of the results. And then hopefully that engages you enough for us all to have a discussion at the end of the presentation. Ryan?
All right, thanks, Graham. As Graham mentioned, my name is Ryan Spiess. I'm a water resources scientist with Lynker. I work with Graham. We also have Dr. Cam Wilbus and Bill Safransky on the call here to help speak to any technical questions and also kind of chip in with some input since they led a couple of these hazard sectors here. So just to get things rolling, Graham already kind of mentioned that the three hazards we were looking at, so flood, drought, and wildfire, were the focus of this project. And down at the bottom of the screen here, you can kind of see these icons that represent those sectors that we considered under each of those hazards. So ideally, we'd be able to explore every sector out there and kind of come up with all of the direct and indirect impacts, but we really had to limit ourselves just to make sure we could come up with a robust framework that covered the entire state. So flooding, for example, here we're looking at damages to our buildings. So these are our homes, our businesses. We also looked at the bridge infrastructure. CDOT has a really robust data set of their bridge inventory, so we're able to lean on some of that data as well. Drought, as you would expect, kind of stretches into several other sectors. So we looked at the whitewater rafting industry, the skiing industry, which may not be important in Larimer County, but is a big driver of some of the state's tourism dollars. So another one we focused on. And then for cattle, we looked at increased expenses to our ranchers and our farmers who have to pay for hauling in feed during times of drought. And then the ag sector, the crops that we grow across the state, all see hits during drought years, and 2020 is a good example of that. And then for wildfire, again, we looked at that building sector, so homes, businesses, as well as the cost to fight wildfires. So we finished this before the 2020 wildfire season set in, so it'd be really interesting to do this analysis with some of the updated data sets that are out there. But this is what we're working with, and this is what when I mention damages to one of these hazards or one of these sectors, this is what we're looking at. All right, so diving into what we mean by some of these future scenarios. For the climate components, we have our current conditions, so today's climate, and then we have two future scenarios that we looked at. So we're going to call them a moderate and more severe scenario. These are largely aligned with what the water plan and the update to the Colorado water plan, how they've defined some of their future scenarios out to 2050. So that's what we look at in terms of climate. So 3 different scenarios there. And then in terms of population growth, we have a current population, which I think is actually from 2018 now. So that's a $5.5 million people statewide. And then 3 future scenarios, so a low, medium, and high growth. And again, you can see those numbers increase up to almost doubling by the time we hit 2050 with that high growth scenario. And just to dig a little bit deeper into what goes underneath the analysis for those future population growth scenarios. So I've honed in here on Larimer County on this bar graph just to give you a sense of what those numbers look like for the area you're interested in. And pretty similar to what we're looking at statewide. Again, approaching a doubling under the hot growth scenario, but again, pretty big numbers jumping up here in 2050 with increased population throughout the county. The map on the right, so once we've established that these population growth numbers, and I should mention that these are also coming from the state's projections, so the state demographic office produces their forecast, and that also gets incorporated into the water plan. So again, we're aligning these scenarios as much as we can with what the state is already pulling together in terms of future climate impacts, future growth impacts. So we have these county-wide projections of where the state may be heading in terms of growth, and we needed a way to distribute that population on the landscape. So in order to do this for the entire state, we landed on the data sets from the EPA called the Integrated Climate and Land Use Scenario Product. And again, this is just looking at different land use types and areas where growth can happen. And that's what you're seeing on that map to the right there. This is just a kind of a current representation of the different land use types that are occurring in just part of the county. I kind of honed into the urban corridor here of Estes Park, Loveland, and Fort Collins. So the legend down there at the bottom kind of gives you a sense of those darker pinks and red colors indicate higher density of people, and then the lighter yellows represent some of those more rural areas of the county.
And Ryan, just real quick, it looks like the very bottoms of these slides might be getting cut off, at least on my Zoom. So just be aware of that.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. Not sure how that's happening. One more, just real quick, little GIF here that's going to cycle back and forth between a current and future growth. And it's kind of hard to see maybe on a small screen here, but I've put a couple ovals and circles in here to kind of focus your attention to what happens in the future under increased population. So all along this kind of corridor here, which is, as some of you may know, we could probably call the wildland urban interface, we see quite a bit of development. We see some more oranges, more urbanized development happening. And I also put these arrows in here to kind of show these are areas that the ICLUS data set at least is showing where people are going to show up on the landscape that currently don't exist, maybe in areas of shrub or timber areas that, again, are right next to that wildland urban interface corridor. And as I mentioned earlier, that EPA ICLUS data set is very handy in that it covers the entire country. These projections may be inaccurate for parts of Larimer County, but it's a good data set to at least get the conversation going. And hopefully, if you guys have more robust, more local data sets, we could easily incorporate those and get a better idea of what that future land use is going to look like. All right, and I just want to give a quick sense here of what goes into these models that we're developing so that once we start to show some results, you can have an idea of how all this comes together. So we have this little schematic here to kind of illustrate this is how the flood analysis comes together. So starting in the upper left here, we need some information on floodplain and stream flow to get a sense of what the hazard itself looks like. So we can lean on data sets from FEMA and from the state that have these multiple reoccurrence interval data. So your 5-year floodplain, your 100-year floodplain, your 500-year floodplain, all of those different reoccurrence intervals go into this analysis. And CAM's approach here is unique in that we're not just looking at the 100-year floodplain. This is accounting for all the floods out there. On the property value side of things, so I mentioned we have that land use component. We also are pulling in the FEMA HAZUS data set, the general building stock inventory, and that gives us property values at the census block level. So we can start to establish kind of an average replacement cost for the building infrastructure that we're looking at. And then these last two components we've kind of already touched on. So for population, again, we're going to lean on the Colorado Water Plan, and then we're going to distribute that across the landscape with that ICLUS data set. And then for the climate component, we have our downscaled hydrology, and we have our climate projections that feed into how do those floodplains interact in the future. And the last thing I'll mention on here, you'll notice everything is trickling into that gray model, and that's producing the damage value that we're going to look at. And I'll explain that here a little bit more in just a second. So one more example, this is the wildfire approach. And again, in the upper left here, this is our wildfire behavior model. So Graham mentioned we partnered with TechnoSilva, who they're the ones that developed the CORAP model, the Colorado Wildfire Risk Assessment Portal model that the State Forest Service uses. We use that same model framework to then project future scenarios of wildfire behavior. On the inventory side of things, again, the same FEMA HAZUS general building stock information. And then for our population, again, the same input, that water plan population spread across the landscape with ICLUS. And for our climate scenarios, we're, again, aligning with the water plan as much as possible using those temperature projections that the state has developed for their water plan and the update to the water plan to keep us closely aligned with what they're producing. All right, so once we have these models pulled together, we can crank the knob and produce these dollar value damages. And these are all going to be in 2019 nominal dollars. And the unit that you might hear me refer to here is these are annualized damages or expected annual damages. So this isn't going to capture those years where we have a massive flood or a massive wildfire. We're going to spread those costs over a 30-year time period. So you can get a sense of what you could expect on any given year and kind of use that as a budgeting sort of number to think about. And then on the right, I just have a quick infographic here kind of showing we can blend all these different types of scenarios together, and you can hone in on which scenario combination you're most interested in. And we didn't want to just give you one deterministic value because there's a wide range of uncertainty with both the climate component, the population growth, and the underlying models themselves. So we want to make sure that everybody had access to looking at a full range of scenarios. And I'm going to step through just a few bar graphs here, kind of giving you the Larimer County results. And I'm going to hone in on 3 different values. So we're going to look at the current population, current climate, and then we're going to kind of look at a low end and a high end. So a low growth population, a moderate climate, and then the last one would be a high growth with a severe climate. So diving into this bar graph here, this is, again, I'm honing in on just the Larimer County results. And for flooding, you'll have to remember we're looking at damages to our buildings as well as our bridges. So those are the 2 sectors that are being quantified in these numbers you see in front of you. Again, I touched on what those 3 scenarios look like. I also have in white numbers here the multiplier on where we currently are. So current conditions represent the most recent 20, 30 years up to relatively recent conditions. And then these 2 future scenarios are centered on the year 2050. So for flooding, you can read the numbers here. We're looking at a little over doubling under this moderate climate and low growth, and over quadrupling that number under the more severe climate and high growth. So this is all coming from that combination of adding more people to the landscape, more people in those floodplains that may or may not be defined at this point, as well as seeing increased probabilities for flooding. All right, real quick on drought. I didn't give you the model schematic for the drought just because there's a unique one for each of the sectors we looked at. So I'll keep this fairly high level, and if you have questions, we can definitely revisit that. But for drought conditions, this is going to cover the recreational boating industry, so your whitewater rafting companies, as well as the livestock and agricultural crop production. So same sort of layout as I just went through before. Right now, we're sitting around $2 million in expected annual damage, which is quite a bit lower than some of these other hazards. But again, those numbers increase pretty dramatically, a 5-fold and a 6-fold increase as we start to look at future climate and future growth. And you may be asking what growth has to do with livestock and with crop production. We're actually taking land offline as growth expands into currently occupied areas that are designated as farms and ranches and pasture land. So that's how we're accounting for growth on those 2 sectors. We're actually taking offline some of those areas where those are produced right now. All right, now for wildfire. Again, this is looking at the building infrastructure, so our homes and businesses, as well as the suppression costs that the state pays to fight those fires. Right now, around $7 million. Again, it'd be interesting to see what these numbers look like after we add in the 2020 wildfire season. But again, you see those numbers increase quite a bit, almost doubling under that low scenario, and more than tripling by the year 2050.
Ryan, I think we lost your audio. Or is
Yeah.
that just me?
No, that's me. I was just about to say that too.
Hey,
Ryan?
can you hear us?
Ryan, can you hear us?
Uh-oh.
I'll text him.
You say you're texting them, Graham?
Yeah, there's nothing I can do on my end, I don't think. Because it looks like he's unmuted, so.
Yeah, it was a pretty dramatic stop.
Yeah, it was. There was a little pop.
Yeah. I think something came unplugged.
Now I was thinking, why on earth is Graham calling me in the middle of my presentation?
And it worked.
Hey, Ryan, we lost you.
Can you hear me?
I can
Yeah.
hear you on the phone, but you're off the audio. If you want to just keep talking, this should work, I think.
Otherwise, Graham, you can probably cover these two. These are just diving into some of the resilience aspects of the project. You want to cover these?
Can everybody hear Ryan without coming through my phone?
I can.
Surprisingly.
Go ahead, Ryan. I think this will work just coming through my phone. If not, I'll.
Okay.
And Ryan, do you want to back it up? You were mid wildfire when it cut out.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem. We couldn't flag you down.
Yep.
All right. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. Okay. Taking a step back here to wildfire, I think I mentioned that this is looking at the building infrastructure as well as the fire suppression costs. Kind of a similar story. You'll notice all these bar graphs look relatively similar, but they're all showing kind of a stair-stepping pattern as far as we turn up the climate and add more people to the landscape, you can see these numbers increase. So doubling under that low scenario and more than tripling under the more severe climate high growth. And I think you might already hear me, but it'd be really interesting to see what these numbers look like after adding 2020 into the fold. Okay, and the last bar graph I'll show for today is adding up all three of those hazards together. So again, we're just looking at these handful of sectors, looking at those direct impacts. So there's way more damages out there that we're not accounting for. We're well aware of that, but this gives us that initial sense of what we could expect to each of these sectors when we really dial into each one of them. So like the others that you've seen already, we're seeing that stair step more than doubling under that low scenario and over quadrupling up to almost $100 million in expected annual damage from these three hazards just in Larimer County. And if you want to look at these results for yourself, the Colorado Water Conservation Board has the FACE portal that allows you to dive into these and kind of pick through the scenarios that you may be interested in. I just cherry picked kind of the high and low end to give you a sense of what the numbers look like. But the next thing I'll mention here, and I know Cam kind of helped put these slides together, so Cam, feel free to chime in here. The second aspect of our project was also looking at, well, how does resilience play in all this? We aren't just producing these numbers to scare everybody and give a sense of kind of a doom and gloom. We really want this information to help feed into that decision-making process in terms of why it's important and why it makes good sense to invest in resilience and invest in adaptation. So again, if you dive into the Colorado Water Conservation Board's webpage that we pulled together for this project, you can pull up some of these quad charts, these little graphs that I have displayed on the screen. This is showing a whole range of adaptation and resiliency strategies that the state and others across the region have kind of documented as far as these things work. These are things that are currently being put in place. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here as far as giving you a one-stop shop for where you could find what strategy makes sense for you. This is really kind of a brainstorming place for everybody to kind of gather ideas, reach out to groups who are having success with some of these strategies and these ideas, so that we can start to relate what is the cost of inaction and then what can we do about it. That's kind of the theme of this project is by understanding that cost, we can start to seriously look at what makes sense in terms of investing in our own resilience. Oops. And the last one I'll show here, I think I was just showing the one for flooding. We have each of these tailored to the hazards. So you can dial up each of the hazards that you're interested in and click on these icons and they'll produce a little pop-up that gives you some more insight and more information on what you could do to research those ideas and connect with people who are currently using them. Cam, was there anything else that you wanted to cover on these?
No, that last point is the one I was going to make, is that, if you go to the interactive version of this, each one of these, you can click on it. It'll give you a real world example of something that's happened in the state of Colorado and a community that's done one of these things. So it seems like a good resource for communities to be able to start connecting with one another and figuring out how to implement some of these resilience actions, because, the dollars get really, really daunting when you just kind of look at what the future looks like. And everyone, I think, at this point wants to know, well, what do we do about it? So I think this could be a good resource for a lot of communities.
Yeah, and as Cam mentioned here, this is just a little animation that's going to walk through what you can do on the FACE webpage. And I didn't want to do a live demo just to kind of keep things simple, but I would encourage anybody who's interested in kind of diving into the project. There's a whole methodology section if you want to learn a little bit more about how we hold together these models. But yeah, I think we went through a lot of effort to make this as interactive and as easy to access as we could. So highly encourage anybody to dive in there and provide feedback if you have thoughts or ideas. So I put this slide in here as kind of a pause for questions because I wanted to make sure that we addressed anything that I may have covered here before we dived into some of the future ideas that we have. So I'll hit mute here for a second and anybody else can chime in.
I just had a question about your bridge data. Was that just CDOT data? Or did you include all the major, I guess, bridges in Larimer County?
I think it was primarily CDOT, just again, because we needed to have a state consistent data set for the whole state. And we didn't really have the scope to go to every individual county and extract all that bridge information for every county. So it was a uniform CDOT data set that we built it on. And that's one of the issues, well, not an issue, but it's one of the things that I think communities need to drill into when they start exploring this tool, is that because our mandate was to look at things at a state level, we really had to restrict our analysis to things where we had a statewide data set that was collected in a consistent way. But the framework we've developed is really very easily modified and super flexible so that, you know, if a particular county wanted to drill into one of these things in more detail, like for example, Larimer County bridge data, you know, we can incorporate that on a more local level.
Just wanted to acknowledge that there's a couple questions that have been asked and answered, both on the chat. There was a question there from George, one of our board members, about the wildfire models that Bill seems to have answered. And then on the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, there was a question that one of our attendees asked that Graham seems to have answered. I don't know if we need to touch on those anymore. People can just read what's there.
I did post a link there to the CWCB's FACE website.
Yeah, thanks for that, Shelley.
All right.
Any other questions at this point from our ESAB folks?
Yes. So this is David. Maybe it's just my naivete, but I was a little bit surprised to see flood mapping at so high a cost and so high an energy level when, again, maybe I'm naive, but I thought that Larimer County had actually done a lot of that after the floods that happened 7 years ago. So is that all incorporated, or are we talking a lot of costs because we're trying to take this an order of magnitude better in mapping?
Good question. And the answer, again, is related back to our mandate, which was to do something at a state level. We weren't able to incorporate individual flood mapping efforts for individual counties, other than we did take into account the risk map studies that had been done where there are multiple flood recurrence intervals. So any place where there is a multi-flood recurrence interval study done, we tried to get those data. But the foundation for the analysis was the flood hazard mitigation plan that was done at a state level. I believe it was 2014, which was based on the 100-year floodplains mapped at a statewide level using a consistent methodology. And so we built off of that because that was the only statewide analysis we had. And then in the places where we had multi-recurrence interval depth grids, which I think was 7 or 8 locations around the state, we were able to compare what came out of the 2014 statewide hazard mitigation plan to what you would get if you incorporate those multi-flood levels, so the 5, 10, 20, 100 and 500 year events. And we use that to apply a scalar to the statewide data. So in other words, if you look at just 100-year flood events, you'll get an expected annual damage of some dollar value per county. If you look at all of the flood recurrence interval events, you'll get a higher expected annual damage because it incorporates those smaller and larger floods, and you can calculate the actual area under the curve of the multiple flood hazard events. And so we use those data where we had them, the multi-recurrence interval data, to apply a scalar to that statewide analysis. And there's a detailed kind of technical memo that describes kind of how we did all this stuff. I'd encourage you to look at that. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. But again, the foundation was always anything we had that was at a state level, we had to start with. And that was the 2014 flood hazard mitigation plan.
So in some ways, David, this is analogous to the answer that we gave on the question about the bridges on the data for vulnerability. Is, we didn't include all of the bridges if they were outside of the main state databases. And similarly with the natural hazards, we had to be consistent with the inputs of the natural hazard component of the project to make sure that the results were consistent across all the counties. So for example, a few locations now have erosion hazard maps that have been developed, and we've helped develop the approach to doing that for the state. In many cases, the damage will be far greater as a result of flows that have sediment-laden mixes coming down and they're laterally eroding banks way outside of the currently mapped 100-year floodplain. But we didn't take that into account because that's not consistently able to be done over all of the rivers that are vulnerable to that hazard in the state. But the methodology, as you could bring in bridges for Larimer County, you could also bring in more detailed hazard maps, whether they're flood or channel migration zone hazard maps, and do a more refined study at the local level using the same approach that Cam used for flood, Bill used for wildfire, and the rest of the team used for drought, for example.
This is Kat Smith. I have a quick question, and I may have missed it, but is the model, are you able to go in and kind of say, okay, if we did, I don't know, restricted development in this high risk area, would it be able to show the costs changing or whatever, the modeled costs, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's certainly the goal. And for flooding and also for wildfire, Ryan showed you those ICLUS land use projections. Again, we had to have something that was done consistently at a state scale. So what we did for flooding was we looked at, given those kind of national scale projections of land use cover changes, how much more development is happening in the buffer between the 100 and the 500 year floodplain, for example. And that's what went into our analysis. We could just as easily have said, okay, what if we completely restrict all development in that buffer between the 100 and 500 year floodplain and redo the analysis? And you can definitely get a sense of what the benefit is of that kind of a land use restriction, for example. And I mean, no one can build a 100-year floodplain right now anyway, but we made the assumption that there's no building in 100-year floodplains under any circumstances, but that, development could impinge on that kind of buffer between the 100 and the 500-year floodplain. So you could definitely do those sort of scenario analyses of like, what if we restrict development in these areas? And likewise for wildfire, what if we restrict development in the wildland urban interface? What is the benefit of that?
One of the challenges with using these consistent data sets, as in consistent at the state scale, is that the ICLUS data, for example, while a lot of work goes into approximating where the projected population is likely to sit on the landscape, it doesn't do that in great detail. So it's not sort of building out to a fine level of resolution. And that's the same challenge as what we just mentioned in terms of the flood. If we don't have information that's consistent for the entire state for channel migration, then we can't really bring it into the study, because then it's comparing apples and oranges when we're looking at things scaled up to the state level. But again, your planners at the city of Loveland or the city of Fort Collins and other locations in the county could do those build outs and make a more refined estimate using the ICLUS data to make sure that the people that are projected to set themselves on the landscape are exactly where planners think they're most likely to end up. So I think what we as a team feel and the state feels is that we've met the mission, which was laid out at the beginning of this conversation, and has also created a framework for other groups to take the information and the methodology and refine the spatial precision behind the results and other components as well, or refine the climate change projections, for example, as new information comes online.
Yeah, I had
Any
a
other
quick question if
questions at
this
this
is a good
point?
time to ask. Yeah, I had a quick question.
Sure,
I think
jump in.
I think this is during Ryan's talk. For the drought component, you mentioned it takes into account whitewater recreation. Does it also include flat water recreation?
No, I don't believe we did include flat water recreation. And again, that was data dependent, the areas that we were able to look at. And frankly, I thought we did really well. Adam Walaski led this for us, did really well to connect with groups such as American Whitewater to get some really solid data to bring into that analysis. But that was, I'm pretty confident, was entirely whitewater. Ryan or Cam or Bill, had any confidence?
Yeah, and I think the reason for that is because it was easier to monetize because, people pay whitewater outfitters to go on whitewater rafting trips. And so we could actually figure out the economic benefit of that recreational use in an easy way without having to do, a contingent valuation study of how much people value flat water canoeing or things like that they don't have to actually pay someone to do. So that was why it was the lower hanging fruit on the water recreation end of things, is because it was easy to monetize.
Yeah, that's a really good thought though. And contemplating that on the fly here, I do recognize that there are quite disparate groups that whitewater recreate versus flat water, and they're probably similar in size. The flat water might even be larger. I really don't know.
Well, I think it's, in some ways it might be easy to monetize if you look at, the county runs a lot of, they run a lot of reservoir venues. So they're you could look at just
park passes would be part of
park use, because those are county run entities. So, but the trick would be, how would you, model the drought impacts on that, I think. But there is definitely, those are big revenue streams for the county, because Larimer County does run a number of flat water specific, recreation venues, reservoirs.
Right. Yeah. And actually that brings up another good point, which was another reason it was that whitewater was easier to monetize, is it's easy to figure out based on flow, when can you take a raft down a river and when can you not. Yeah. So that was another reason.
Yeah, threshold that Adam, our team member, found that was fairly consistently observed across all of the outfitters. I think with some of the flat water areas, it's conceivable that even in the worst drought years, you're still going to have a lot of people trying to get on the water, because it's often hot during a drought year, and any stretch of water is desirable. But good thought.
Yeah,
check and get back to you on that.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident that we did dive into the state's records on park visitation, which in some cases I think they were breaking down boating permits on reservoirs and whatnot. But I think that the hinge pin was it just wasn't a robust enough data set statewide to give us confidence we could pull it off for all 64 counties. So I think there is some good data out there, and we're working on another drought project for NIDIS right now that is diving into some of those details. So we may be able to come up with some ideas on that one in the future.
Great, thank you.
This is Kat Smith again. I'm just curious, have you done this for any other states? I think this is a really, really useful tool.
No, not yet. Although It's not dissimilar from a nationwide study that we've been involved in that EPA has led called CIRA, the Climate Impacts and Risk Analysis Study, which is a much longer, I mean, that's been going on for 10 years, but it's a sector-specific nationwide analysis of the monetary impacts of climate change on a whole bunch of sectors, very similar to this. But yeah, at a state level, I think, the finer the resolution, we've touched on this a couple times, even in this call, the finer the resolution, the more useful it becomes, right? Like at a national scale, same problem. You need to worry about data sets that you can compile at a national scale. At a state scale, you need to be able to focus on things that you can focus on at a state scale. And only when you kind of get down to the local level can you actually start using that in a really robust way to make decisions. And so I think the model is easily transferable, and I think it'd be really fun to work on this for other states and municipalities as well.
And on that first slide, you may have noticed FEMA Region A was listed as one of the federal groups that were involved in the project. They represent, I think, 5 or 6 states, and they've definitely expressed interest in expanding this type of analysis to their whole domain at some point in the future. So that may be something that could occur in the not so distant future.
Yeah.
All right, great questions, everyone. Keep them coming, definitely. We're gonna slightly shift gears a little bit and just kind of, talk about some ideas about translating all of these a little bit more local, and what that kind of might look like for Larimer County. And can everybody hear me all right? I guess so, because nobody's.
Yep.
All right, cool. So, as Ryan and Graham have mentioned already, this was our mandate, was to do a statewide analysis, and so we were taking data sets that were either available, across the whole state, or in some instances, CONUS-wide, nationwide data sets. So, in the case of the, valuing assets, so valuing these different data sets, infrastructure that we are looking at, we really relied on the HAZUS data set for buildings. And so, one improvement that we see that could be done is using local county data sets, local parcel data set to, to better, estimate what those damages might look like. So that would be, helpful for, for the flood analysis, the wildfire analysis, and if there were, more local information on the farming and whatnot, we could bring that into the analysis as well. Similarly, for future population build outs, we use that ICLUS data set to distribute spatially Colorado's population projections. So those are just models of where they think that people are going to move. But of course, Larimer County or any county probably has a better estimate of both where they think growth is going to be and kind of where growth is restricted or designated to be through zoning. So that would be a local improvement of the analysis. We'll go next slide, Ryan. So similarly, I'm going to talk about wildfire a little bit here. I kind of led the wildfire analysis for the project here, so I'm a little bit partial to what we did for wildfire, of course. So the big thing that Ryan kind of mentioned earlier is like, and Graham, we don't, the WUI is the big deal, right? That wildlife urban interface. And so again, using this national ICLUS data set product, we don't know exactly where people are going to move. So we use that product so we could apply, spatially distributed populations across the state. But if there is better data sets of where population growth will occur, then we'll have a better estimate of where those damages are, because really most of our damages kind of show up in those WUI areas where we see more buildings, more dollars stacked on top of more wildfire risk. And so what I'm showing here in this map is kind of an overlay of those two things. So the risk, if you will, the wildfire hazard is shown in that yellow, orange to red scale, whereas the building values are shown in the blue scale. And so you can see in those urban cores that Ryan's pointing out right now, of course, Fort Collins and Loveland and I noted Estes Park there on the left. So those are those urban centers, but where we have that overlap with that junction of hazard and value, that's where, you know, the models, that's where we really calculate the biggest damages. And so someone had mentioned or asked about adaptation scenarios. So for the wildfire analysis, you know, we didn't actually do an adaptation scenario to calculate how, you know, damages can be reduced given, you know, smart planning or you know, WUI restrictions or defensible space or something like that. So, and part of the reason for that is just, again, that statewide mandate of having to do things. And, you know, it's hard to say what would be a reasonable scenario to model there. But of course, you know, if we took our estimation of future growth and, you know, dialed that back or kind of, you know, omitted growth in certain areas, and that would be a way to monetize and better understand how adaptation and you know, adaptation to wildfire could reduce that risk, for instance. And the same could be said for, like Cam had mentioned, you could, you know, you're able to then understand how your adaptation reduces your flood risk in that space of the 100-year to 500-year floodplain. All right, let's go next slide, right? Another, you know, thought that I've had, some of us have had at Lynker, you know, given the 2020 fire season, is, you know, these large, massive fires burning in these higher elevation areas. So what I'm showing here now is just a snapshot of the model output. And I should say that that model is run at a 30-meter resolution. So it's a really fine detail. And we're aggregating all these results to county level. Now, granted, when we're doing these future projections, we don't have high confidence in, you know, a 30-meter pixel in a model and what it's going to happen, you know, from now until 2050. So, you know, we're not really trying to provide that level of detail, but in this analysis, or in this snapshot, what you can see is we have really low probability, this light yellow, in all these high elevation areas. And, you know, you can see that on both sides of the divide, that's where these fires burned, of course. And so, you know, it's a thought, and this is kind of aside from the damage analysis, but just a kind of a general thought, like, are things already changing? Are we capturing, you know, the likelihood of these wildfires in these high elevations? And also, you know, what was the weather like in the 2020 scenarios, the relative humidity, the temperature, the winds? How do those relate to the data sets that are in the model right now? Are they, you know, is that historical data extreme enough to capture what was happening in 2020? That's, you know, just another kind of back of the envelope or back end modeling question. And then I think I've got one more, and I'm going to hand it off to Cam. So just another thought, you know, I did a quick map here of these recent fires and how they overlay on the watershed. You know, thinking about the large wildfire that Larimer County has already experienced back in 2012, the High Park fire. So I've shown the High Park fire there in pink. And stepping back a second here, what I've shown on the north end is the Poudre River watershed, kind of in that orange hash, and the Big Thompson watershed in that blue hash. And so we can see is just how much of these fires have ended up in which watershed, and what does that mean? So in 2012, High Park burned about 104 square miles in the Poudre River watershed. Well, Cameron Peak now, we have 215 square miles in the Poudre River watershed. So we have a double the burn area we saw from High Park. So, you know, what does that mean moving forward? You know, it has a lot of implications. And I think I'll pass it over to Cam here.
Yeah, and these next couple slides are really just kind of to stimulate some thinking. You know, as we all probably know, flood risk also increases pretty substantially after wildfire. And, you know, now that we're facing all these big burn scars in Larimer County's watersheds, you know, we know that the Cameron Peak burn scar will increase the risk of floods and debris flows in the watersheds downstream. And that's the time to start asking, you know, what are the steps that the county can take, or that the state can take, or that the federal government can take to quantify and, more importantly, mitigate those risks as we move forward after these big burns. And, you know, there's resources out there. There's a, I just put the cover of this Colorado Coast Wildfire Guide up there, which you may all be familiar with, but this is a work in progress from the Army Corps and a whole bunch of federal collaborators that's being finalized kind of as we speak. And then just a little infographic from FEMA just to remind people that floods follow fires. That's something that definitely needs to be thought about moving forward for a lot of Colorado's communities right now. You can go to the next one, Ryan. And then Graham touched on this already, and I'll let him expand on it if he'd like. But, you know, as we all know, living in the Colorado Front Range, you know, flood hazards are not just clear water flooding. It's not just that you can get a whole bunch of water in your living room. It's that these rivers are extremely dynamic. They're sediment laden. They carry debris flows. They move back and forth. And so these are just kind of two iconic pictures, one from the Boulder flood and one from the Big Thompson flood, showing that, you know, some of the hazards from flooding are not just water, right? These rivers can undermine the houses. And these are things that are not well captured in most of the flood models that are out there and most of the damage calculations that are out there. And in particular, you know, FEMA and the Army Corps have these so-called depth damage functions, where if you have a certain amount of depth of water, you can get a sense of how much, you can estimate how much damage might happen to a house. But those things really don't account for any of these sort of fluvial migration zone hazards that are really prevalent in Colorado's watersheds. So you can go to the next one, Ryan. I think this is a Graham slide if he wants to talk about it. We can start to quantify these risks, and I'll let him.
Just very quickly building on what Cam just said. So myself and three other folks developed the channel migration zone mapping technique for Washington State, which is summarized in the bottom left-hand corner. And this is really in response to many locations in the West, including Colorado and including Larimer County, where, you know, channel migration zone is more of a hazard than overbank flooding in many areas. So this is the type of thing that, you know, the county or cities within the county might want to contemplate bringing into this sort of risk assessment study, because certainly the potential for the type of hazard that Cam was just highlighting to become more prevalent and more serious is likely to go up with all of the conditions that we're looking at into the future, with more and more wildfires, more and more sediment-laden flows, which are much more erosive in nature, increase the tendency of certain channels to swing quite unpredictably about in their natural floodplain. Certainly changing things from the point of view of delineating a 100-year clear flow flood hazard. So this really just highlights that there are a number of confounding impacts and confounding impacts that make the study troublesome, and it really just exemplifies what we've been trying to convey throughout, which is we've necessarily been consistent with all the data that we've put into the statewide study. The real value for a group like this group, representing various locations in Larimer County or the county itself, is that the study is flexible enough to bring in more detailed data. And then I did just want to highlight that in some cases, more generalized information about risk is actually a good thing, even at the county scale, because you might not necessarily want to highlight to stakeholders exactly where things are likely to occur, because that creates political sensitivities that planners might not be able to get past, that you might not want to get tangled up in, but you might want to just get over the general message that what we might expect is greater losses as a function of climate change and or population growth. So just wanted to throw that out there.
All right. Well, I'll just pop on real quick and just say that there's been some Q&A going on. I've answered a few on wildfire. Looks like there was one more about stable forest areas. I don't think that I could say that our analysis would provide any information on that. I think if anything, the Colorado State Forest Service or perhaps the U.S. Forest Service would probably have the best information on something like that. I'm not, you know, is that question getting at like you know, the density of trees and pine beetle kill, and you know what hasn't been burned in a long time, and what, you know, what needs to burn, that kind of thing.
Bill, I tried to answer George's question by letting him know that the U.S. Forest Service has brought in a burned area emergency response team to support answering that question, because it's one that so many of us do have. So
Perfect.
yeah, George, Bill is right about that the work that Lynker has done isn't supportive for that question specifically, but there are a lot of folks with that question, and the U.S. Forest Service, as he mentioned, along with the Colorado State Forests, are working to get that information out as soon as possible for a variety of reasons.
Okay, thank you.
Sure thing.
Are there other questions from the ESAB? Well, if I'm not hearing any, I guess I would just try to sum up here. Certainly Larimer County has been tried to be creative and proactive in dealing with resilience within the county. And right now we're in the process of doing some climate action planning. So certainly some of the issues and things in your presentation tonight are very timely and appropriate for those discussions. We also have a new county administration, which will be coming on board about the first of the year. So there may be some changes in direction there. So it's certainly very timely for Larimer County here. I guess I would also note that of the board members on the ESAB, a number of us are consultants and work in a variety of other scenarios out there. So I'm sure the type of work that you've presented here today will certainly give people things to think about as they deal in their other business settings going around. So hopefully that will be useful as well. I guess I'd just like to sum up and you know, thank you know, Graham and Ryan and Cam and Bill for an excellent presentation here tonight, and your attempts to answer a lot of wide-ranging questions. So we certainly appreciate your time tonight. And if I don't hear any other points, I would just say thanks again from the ESAB. We do have an open meeting here with other items. You're certainly welcome to hang out if you're really bored this evening and hear what we have to say and other things, but we certainly understand that you've got lives and work out there. And I saw a young child there in a picture as well. So it looks like it might be bedtime for Ryan's child there. So with that, we'll call this section to a close, and thanks very much, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Jim.
Thanks a lot.
Opportunity a lot. And please
Yeah.
reach out to the emails in front of you right now if you've got any other questions. Thanks, guys.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
So for those of us